Thank you really for being here. This is an incredible turnout, and I'm going to say a little more about that in a minute. I want to plug our next, now that you ask, which is March the 4th, just 2 weeks from now, and former Governor Phil Bredesen will be our guest. And another exciting interview, I think, where we hopefully will learn something about the former governor we've never known before. Our guest tonight is very special, and you've demonstrated that by an overwhelming turnout tonight. He has emerged as a leading presidential historian. He's a contributing editor at Time, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, executive editor of Random House. His book, American Lion, Andrew Jackson and the White House, was a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography in 2009, New York Times bestseller. You've seen him on The Morning Show. You've seen him on Meet the Press, Charlie Rose, and other television shows. It's my distinct honor now to welcome, for what I think will be a very interesting interview, Jon Meacham. If you find it down, that's right. Right here.
You talking about the tornado?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, good.
We've got a legal plan to get out of the way. Thank you, really, for coming.
Thank you.
I know you can do this anywhere you want to do it. We're honored that you're doing it.
Delighted. Thank you.
I want a little audience participation first, and I'm gonna try to come to you once or twice for
Are y'all
Q&A.
drinking? It's cocktail time.
Yeah.
All right. It's gonna be more fun than I thought.
Yours,
All right.
yours is in the bottle. Just don't tell anybody.
Story of my life right here.
That's right. We'll do better next time. So be prepared to raise your hands when we do the Q&A, and hold your hands up because we've got roving mics that'll get to you, and that'll kind of select whose question I go to. We had more responses to this program by scores than we've had to any other. We've had the governor, we've had the first lady, we've had the mayor, we've had the speaker of the House, we've had John Siegenthaler, we've had the producer of Nashville, we've had the president of the college. I'm skipping somebody. I'm skipping somebody. I won't worry about it. And we've had good responses and good audiences, but this one by scores was more. How many of you are here because of John's books?
God bless you all.
How many of you are here because you've seen him on television? And I'm going to do a little marketing test here, too. How many of you saw the Tennessee newspaper article? Okay, good. How many of you heard the NPR ad? Okay, good. Take note, team. It's fascinating to me. I mean, I love you and all that.
But it's always a but.
But it's fascinating how, I mean, really, the strength of the response to your coming tonight. What do you think that celebrity's about? That's what it is.
Well, in a very dorky way. I'm very big in nursing homes around America. Michael Beschloss and I have a bet. At what point will books we write go straight to large print? And that day is coming.
Like Kelly's menu.
Sooner than the storm tonight. I don't know. I'm very lucky, and this is not false modesty. I feel incredibly blessed, and I use that word advisedly, to be able to make a living doing what I'm doing. If you told me 25 years ago that I spent today transcribing George Herbert Walker Bush's 1986 vice presidential diary, not everybody would find that as exciting as I did. Although I suspect some of you will if you came to see me. So you would. And to be able to do what I do, I feel incredibly fortunate. And so I guess part of it is that I do think we're in a kind of golden age of biography. I think there are a lot of people who, because of a feeling that the current political climate is not commensurate to our challenges, I think that a lot of people are hungry to see what's happened in the past and what solutions that might offer. I think that's part of it. And my own sense is that there are a lot of folks who care deeply about the present and feel that there's no easy way to look forward, so one thing you can do, the one thing you can do, is look back. So I suspect that's part of it.
Television?
Oh, sure, but I consider that part of the whole thing. I do think that I've written books that have gotten less attention than the fact that I sit near Mika Brzezinski's arms once a week, and so I think that's part of it. But it's a particular kind of thing. I mean, it's not. You have to care about, to have any interest, whatever in what I have to say. You have to have some interest in history, and so I think that it's more about the subject than it is me.
Okay, good. We'll come back to that. Oh, not just welcome here, but welcome to Nashville.
Well, thank you.
Several people tonight have asked me where you live, and I said we're fortunate enough now that you live here in Nashville. Why? You can live anywhere. Why Nashville?
Right. Grass and dogs.
Grass and dogs.
Grass and dogs. I have 3 children, 11, 9, and 5. The 9-year-old is a little girl. She's going on 32. We're very excited about that. She's smoking less this school year, so we think that's a victory. No kidding. My phone's dying, but I got a call today from George Bush's office, and it just pops up George Bush. And she was playing Angry Birds on my phone, and it popped up that George Bush was calling. She was unmoved by that. And so she finished her game and brought it downstairs and said, George Bush called you. And I said, did you think about maybe answering? And she said, no, I was watching the game. We had 3 kids. We were in New York for nearly 20 years. And my son, who was now 11, was then 8, came in one Friday afternoon and said, there's nothing to do in a New York apartment at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon. And it was very hard for me to argue with that. And so we started looking around and thinking about it. I grew up in Chattanooga. My wife grew up in Mississippi. It's the only sense in which she married up. Was marrying a Tennessean. We can do the Mississippi jokes. I have about 6.
Really?
If you want, yeah.
3 of them.
3 of them. We have electricity, asphalt. We thought about it, and it didn't make sense for us to move to Connecticut or someplace, which is what a lot of people, that's sort of our point, do.
Grass up there.
Yeah, they have grass. They don't have, so we came. I had spent more time here doing the Jackson book than I had really focused on, and so I spent more time in Nashville. We always kept a house in Sewanee, where I went to school. We believed that they needed some ballast from Madison Avenue. They needed Franklin County, and one way of thinking about Sewanee is it's Downton Abbey meets Deliverance. And so
true.
So that was always a cultural experience for them.
We didn't say that.
And so the development office hates it when I say that. I've updated it. It used to be Brightside Revisited. Now I figure we can do that. We moved a year and a half ago and have not had a bad day.
What kind of dog?
Springer Spaniels. Springer Spaniels. 18-month-old and a 5-month-old. Because life isn't complicated enough with 3 children. You need more.
Now, 9-year-old daughter, 11-year-old son.
5-year-old daughter.
5-year-old.
So.
Downton Abbey.
Yeah.
You a fan?
I am. Any TV show that works Teapot Dome into a plot deserves our support. It started with the Titanic. It did World War I, and now Teapot Dome. So I totally believe in it. It is the highest brow soap opera you'll ever get. I keep waiting. They've had Amnesia. They've had Evil Twins.
You watch Nashville?
I don't watch it as much as I should. I watched the first couple of episodes. I'm one of. I suspect. How many of you all binge watch things now? I just binged on Justified. Do you all know this? Totally wonderful. My new hero is one of the meth dealers named, anti-hero, I guess we should say, named Dewey Crow, who speaks in the third person like Bob Dole. Due respect.
Or John Wilder, for those of us from Tennessee.
Oh, John Wilder. You know, Bob Dole says. So Dewey Crow is my new hero.
Okay, good. Let's go back to Chattanooga.
Yes.
Start at the beginning. Tell us where Jon Meacham came from.
I came from a family of lawyers. My great-grandfather was born in Leapers Fork. He was the oldest of 9 children. Went to Vanderbilt, class of 97, and then law school class of 1900. He was on his way to Atlanta to practice law, stopped to see a Vanderbilt classmate in Chattanooga, and got off the train and never got back on. His son, my grandfather, practiced, was the city judge in Chattanooga, wrote 3 Napoleonic-era novels. Wonderful story about this for any of you who want to write, this is actually a great inspirational story. He was a great fan of C.S. Forster, the Hornblower novels. And Forster died with an unfinished book. And the Saturday Evening Post, which was Forster's serializer in those days, published what was there and left Hornblower in a complicated position about Trafalgar. And one of Forster's rules was that it was sort of like Herman Wouk in The Winds of War. The protagonist could always brush up against history but never change it exactly. And so there's sort of a conundrum among the fans. And so my grandfather, this was 1966 probably, sits down and writes how he thought Forster would have solved this problem. Packaged up part 3, sent it off to Little Brown, and said, if you all want to publish this, it's yours. And the publisher liked it, but Mrs. Forster did not. And so in a letter, I probably write 5 or 6 of these letters a week, saying, you know, this is great. If you ever write anything of your own, let me know. I'm sure it would be fascinating, which is code for don't ever write me again. But he took it as an invitation and sat down and created a character named Percival Merriweather, who was a captain with the East India Company, and wrote a novel, and Little Brown published it. Then he wrote another one, and they published it. And they wrote another one, and they published it. So it really changed the latter part of his life. And so I grew up around him, and I grew up going to the Reed House in Chattanooga, where, and I'm not sure how they did this, but every morning at 10 o'clock, some combination of city and county and occasionally state officials would be there for coffee. The taxpayers were not getting a huge amount of efficiency out of these
Actually,
folks.
they made it.
Well, they made it, that's true. But it was Corey Smith, and I remember Al Gore Sr. coming by, and Jim Sasser in the old days. And so I grew up around politicians telling stories. And the combination of growing up around them, going to court with my grandfather as a very young 6, 7 years old, and his historical interest, sort of all those tributaries came together.
All those Pauls, who was the best storyteller?
You know, I think Corey Smith, who was the Hamilton County District Attorney, probably in the 50s, maybe the early 60s.
Cousin of the former U.S. Attorney.
Here we go. Yes, there we are.
Claims to be your cousin.
Remember all these folks, that's right. Who would claim to be my cousin who was not? When you think about it. But was very lucky in my schools. I went to an Episcopal Montessori, which is redundant. I acknowledge that. And even more, ever more so. For 8 years, went to chapel every day, 5 days a week, at St. Nicholas School in Chattanooga, and then went to Macaulay School, alma mater of Howard Baker, Ted Turner and Pat Robertson. We have a foot in every camp. In fact, if you want to stop the storm, we could probably call Pat.
Right. Or Ted.
Or Ted would tell you why it's coming. Pat would try to stop it, and Howard would broker a deal. So it's perfect.
That's right.
And that was another big thing. Growing up on Missionary Ridge was a huge part of this because you could still, when I was growing up, find Manet balls around, and I've got a box of them on my desk. And so I grew up about, I never walked it off. It was between 500 and 600 yards from Bragg's headquarters. And so to me, history was always a tactile matter. It was always right there. And so you stand on Missionary Ridge in Chattanooga, and you can see where Grant was on Orchard Knob, and you see where Arthur MacArthur broke the line, won his Medal of Honor when he was 17 years old. Chickamauga's right down there. John Ross's house was 3 miles this way. So to some extent, Missionary Ridge in Chattanooga, in many ways, embodies two of the great sins of American life to some extent. There's the war over slavery, there's the removal of Native Americans, and it's all right there. And so it was always very real to me.
What age do you remember having that sensibility?
Well, we were, as a very young kid, you would want to go out and see if you could find the bullets. So that's just a very geeky Easter egg hunt, I guess, to some extent. But I think that I was 6, 7, 8 years old, and
Writing history in the gene.
yeah, it was. It is, and I think that part of the interest in politics and political history is that growing up around those old guys around the table and then reading about them in the paper, you saw the parallelism and you saw the gulf sometimes between the personality and what Dick Copper would write.
Yeah, right. Dick Copper. You are a former reporter for the Chattanooga Times, where you worked.
I did. Great man, Dick.
Do you remember your favorite Corey Smith story?
Well, I think it has to do with Bookie Turner. Do you remember Bookie?
Former police chief of
Police commissioner. But he was elected police commissioner, and then his daughter, of course, was in the legislature. But Bookie used to argue that his nickname came from his great interest in literature.
Right.
As opposed to being more of a vocational moniker. And so I don't think I can repeat most of those, but
that's a good tease, though. Anything else about growing up that stands out? You mentioned your grandfather, your father, your mother, siblings.
Yeah, I'm an only child. They figured that's enough of that. I get very lucky. Lots of teachers who took an interest.
Favorite teacher?
There are a couple of two stand out. One was John W. Day, who was my 7th grade history teacher at Macaulay School, who, in a sign of the times, you could still, when I was in the 7th grade, refer to a pop quiz as a Jap, and no one would bat an eye. I don't think that's still prevalent in the curriculum at Macaulay. There's a man named John Strang, graduate of the University of Virginia, veteran of World War II, Japanese POW, who went to the divinity school at Sewanee, taught Bible. He, great tennis coach, great tennis player. We called him Yo. And his perennial extra credit question was 2 parts on every exam. Who was on the road to Damascus and where was Saul going?
You got that one right.
By the 3rd trimester, we'd worked it out.
Where did you meet your wife from Mississippi?
I met my wife on a Sunday evening in Sewanee in the spring of 1988. I was in my first year at Sewanee and had, the previous Saturday evening, I had been engaged in a wild turkey shooting contest that did not involve firearms.
Explain.
And had lost to a girl from Charleston South Carolina. Just, it was like that scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, remember? Where it was just awful. And so I was resting that Sunday. I was taking the Sabbath quite literally, and the phone rang, and there's a Nashville connection here. The phone rang, and it was Douglas Pascal, who was then a professor of English at Sewanee, later the headmaster of MBA, and Douglas said, we have this brilliant girl from Mississippi who's coming in to see if she might want to come to school here, and I want you to come over and talk to her. And I didn't know there were brilliant girls from Mississippi. And so that's
Any Mississippi girl?
That's number 3 on Mississippi. And so I stumbled out of it. I said, yes, sir, I'll be right there. Let me put my Jon Milton down. And so I stumbled into the shower and got over there. And I walked into the vice chancellor's residence, and there was this beautiful girl sitting in the corner. And I thought, well, you know what? I'm going to go talk to her and then find the brilliant girl from Mississippi. And it turned out to be what I wanted to say. I lost miserably. She went to Virginia. So I failed in my task. It was one of the first of many arguments that I lost. But we actually had an epistolary romance for 5 years. It took me 5 years to get a movie date. So persistence ultimately paid off. And then we ended up in Washington at the same time. And I finally got her to go out, and we went to see The Age of Innocence, the great Edith Wharton movie. So again, I'm a pretty glamorous date. Yeah. I couldn't get away with that jacket.
You look very nice, brother.
Oh, thank you.
First book you remember reading?
Oh, that's a great question. Treasure Island. But that was part of our, we were.
So you thought all books had to be big?
I had to be big and had to have gunfights. That's why I did Jackson. I think that there was a sort of a running contest in the family over Treasure Island trivia. So, are there Stevenson fans here? Does anybody remember the name of the skeleton with the yellow hair who pointed the way to the treasure? Allardyce. Allardyce was the rosebud of my childhood. If you could get Allardyce, life was good. And actually, I have a copy of I guess Scribner's did a beautiful set of children's books in those days, or younger adult books. And my grandfather had signed it to me 2 days after I was born. So he had high hopes for Norbert.
Favorite book ever?
Hugely important book was, and I mentioned him before, Herman Wouk's historical novels were really important to me. The Winds of War, War and Remembrance, The Caine Mutiny. I read the 2 war novels I read at least 3 times each.
So is he the favorite of all, or was it yourself?
Well, it was just very important because it was an early case. It was narrative history that wasn't narrative history. It was historical fiction. But that was, and Wouk, like Forster, the history was all accurate. In fact, I did a biography of the friendship between Roosevelt and Churchill. Was my first book, and I went back to look at War and Remembrance, and realized that a lot of what I knew about the different summits came from that, and the history was 100%. It was great.
Couple Q&A in a few minutes. Couple of questions here, so get ready and raise your hands when that comes. That's an interesting question. History is 100%. Can you ever be sure history is 100%?
No, it's like a trial. But you can, I think, figure out whether it's sound enough. I mean, in a fictional context, is it sound enough that you can prove it in a clinical way, prove those facts? It is inarguable that at Tehran in November of 1943, Roosevelt sided with Stalin against Churchill about going across the channel at the earliest possible hour, which Churchill did not want to do because he would still live in terror of another Gallipoli, which had traumatized his political career and led to such terrible death in the First World War. So, insofar as history, theology can be true but not accurate. History has to be accurate, and then we can argue about the truth later.
Anything you've ever made up?
We can go back to the Mississippian for a while. No. What you do have to do if you're going to write narrative history, though, is you do have to treat it as a cinematic exercise. And I mean that in terms of form, if not content. My own view is, if I'm writing the draft of a book, and I'm on, 5,000 or 6,000th word, and somebody couldn't come along and dramatize it, couldn't put it up on here or on a screen, then I may be impressing myself with some analytical point, but I'm probably letting the reader down. So always having some theatrical detail that's
And that's a very conscious thought, as you're right.
Totally. Because, to my mind, the competition for your mind share is so ferocious now. It always has been, but ever more so today, that to ask people to invest the money and the time in a big book of history, I feel a definite sense of covenant with the reader, that I have to keep them entertained because they have so many other things they could be doing. And that doesn't mean you gild the lily or cut corners, but it does mean you do everything you can to make sure the scenery is painted as well as possible.
Very interesting. I remember Teddy White, traveling with him. Teddy White wrote great presidential campaign books, and he would sit at the front of the bus, and you couldn't talk to him because he was counting bushes and trees and stop signs.
Yeah.
It was all part of the scenery.
He's one of the people who, arguably one of the most influential journalists ever. The Making of the President in 1960 is responsible for an entire generation or more of political journalists, all of whom thought every presidential race was going to be like Kennedy versus Nixon.
Right.
As it turned out, it didn't. But he was really the first one to popularize the idea of a presidential campaign as an Arthurian quest, where the hero was going to overcome snares and toils and trouble. And those books do hold up pretty well.
They really do.
I think I always push. I did the introduction to a reissue of the 1964 one. That I think in some ways is more interesting because you do see in Goldwater's defeat almost everything that happened since.
Very interesting. One more question, then we're going to come to you. Do you consider yourself a journalist most, a writer most, a historian most?
I'm a recovering journalist. We have meetings, if you all want to come. They're in basements, we have coffee. I loved being a journalist for a long time. I started after my first year at Sewanee, when I was a freshman in college. Paul Neely of the Chattanooga Times, which was the Ox family's first and slightly less successful investment before the New York Times. I had a free internship that I could do something in public service, and I managed to convince a foundation board that journalism was a public service. I'm one of the few people in history to have done that.
Good.
Yeah.
Very good.
You're a recovering journalist too.
Oh, yeah, I hadn't even recovered yet.
I think now of myself as a writer and editor.
An editor,
Yeah.
which do you like? They're very different jobs.
They are.
Which
One
do
is
you like?
one is being a patient, one is being a doctor.
Yeah, which do you like best?
I love being able to do both, and I wouldn't want to only do one or the other, if that makes sense. Because And I didn't understand editing as an art form, which is what it really is. And it is a form of psychotherapy, being that most writers are totally insane. Not partially.
Totally.
And until I was at the Washington Monthly. I went from the Chattanooga Times to the Washington Monthly, where Charlie Peters, the great founding editor, you were paid $10,000 a year, and for 2 years, and then he would help you. Part of the covenant was he would help you get a job at a larger place. And Kate Boo, who's a marvelous writer, Pulitzer Prize winner several times over, I think, just published a wonderful book on poverty in India last year called "Behind the Beautiful Forevers," which if you don't know it, it's worth your time, very much so. Kate said she always knew she left the monthly's orbit when she could order an entree as well as an appetizer at a restaurant. So it was kind of like a journalism school where you got a little bit of money. But you were an editor, and you were writing your own piece, you were putting the magazine together, and there's a great joy in that. I imagine it's not unlike running a campaign or any organization or school. There's a part of one's brain and one's emotional makeup that finds a certain fulfillment in making the whole symphony work.
Well put. Question. If microphone will go to the hand, and we'll go there first.
So I'm a recovering journalist as well, and started to follow you when you were at Newsweek. What was the interview that you did that you were most proud of, and why? And what's the interview, if you had a chance, that you still would like to get, and why?
Great question.
That is a great question. The interview, well, I'm proudest of our work. I was at Newsweek from 1995 until 2010, so a long time. I'm still proudest of the work we did just after the attacks in 2001. It was a case where the entire magazine, an entire really generation of journalists who had spent time learning about, caring about the Taliban when most people didn't, trying to understand the national security apparatus, trying to understand how the increasing narrowness of the world, the coming together of the world mattered. All of that became suddenly quite relevant, and obviously, and so that was really the most remarkable set of issues. In terms of people I would love to have talked to, that's a great question. I'd love to have talked to Nixon, just because it would have been fun. Did you know Nixon?
Covered his campaign in '68.
Did you?
That's not to say I knew him.
Well, Pat didn't know him, so that's a whole different thing. Knowing Nixon is a whole different thing. So I think that would have. I never met Reagan, which, particularly given his significance culturally and politically as we get farther away from him, I think would have been fascinating. Closest I ever came to him was actually in Nashville when he came to speak to the legislature, I think in '83. 82.
That's about right, 82, I think.
82. And I was in the, remember Bob Davis, state of Chattanooga? He gave us his tickets in the gallery. And actually Reagan, earlier that day, went to the Hermitage and he gave a talk and managed to, as only Reagan could do, he managed to invent a quote for Jackson that Jackson hadn't actually said, but it was so good no one cared, which kind of is the essence of Ronald Reagan. What do you think about it? One man with courage makes a majority. It's a wonderful line. Jackson never said it, but there we are. So the best lunch I ever had. I was thinking about this today because of where I am in doing biography of and it was like being at a History Channel version of the Star Wars bar scene. It was George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev. And Gorbachev's translator, remember, who looks like the funeral undertaker in The Godfather. Remember, he was always in those pictures. And I just sat there, and it was as though I was in a movie. Because Gorbachev was talking over his translator. Who knows what he was really saying? And Bush was so happy to be with him that I was just like this. That's a technical historical term. So I've been incredibly lucky. I mean, one of the great reasons, as you know, to be a journalist is you do get to, most people will talk to you at some point. And they always have an agenda, a reason to talk to you. But I feel very lucky to have been able to be fairly close to a lot of folks.
Next.
I'm a history major, I was in school, and I read so much history. I've got about 1,500 books at home, history, and 3 of them are yours signed. So I didn't bring any of yours to sign, but you mentioned Herman Wouk. I've got both of his books at home, War and Remembrance and Winds of War, and the DVD versions. And if I was going to tell you something and ask you something, who do you think did a better job of playing Aaron Jestro? John Houseman or Sir John Gielgud? And when they were doing the Holocaust thing, and Sir John Gielgud was going to be, his character was going to be in the crematoriums. He looked up at the moon. He went to see it for the last time. That really gets to me. I didn't see the Schindler's List because of that scene. Since I'm a history major, and I've been to Germany last year, the Marshall Foundation, I got to see George Patton's granddaughter and George Marshall's grandson and go to the American Embassy for dinner. But anyway, my favorite scene in the War and Remembrance and Winds of War is and I love the music, I've got it on CD, is that scene where Robert Mitchum is at the very end of Winds of War, standing on the bank, looking down at the ships that were bombed in Pearl Harbor, and says that famous line. It makes me cry, and I've got it printed up at home, that we're into the war, that we've got to win this war, because until the monster Hitler is beaten, this world will not move toward a saner, or move another inch toward a sane existence. I wanted you to comment on that. That's one of my favorite scenes of all moviedom, and
Okay.
I'd never read fiction.
What do you say to that?
Yeah. You're right on all fronts. I don't have a theatrical opinion about the different portrayals, but I should. Because God knows I have opinions about other things. I think that it's a case where, I think Woke's achievement there is a case where fiction can sometimes reach a bit, to go to your question, reach a bit higher, reach a bit farther than straightforward narrative history can. And those books were enormous bestsellers. I don't know if they're read much today, actually, but they should be. Woke was very resistant to having Hollywood do anything with the books. I don't know, I think he not liked the Caine Mutiny movie, which I kind of understand. But it took a long time, and he had absolute control over everything, which is one reason why I think, in fact, the miniseries has lasted longer than the war itself did. But there's a statistic, I'm not going to get it exactly right, but something like 2, 3, 4,000 veterans of the Second World War die every week. Again, I'm a little bit off on that, but there's this enormous attrition rate. And you think about the enormity of that experience and how it really is receding in the way the Civil War is now receding. It's extraordinary to me that there's now as much distance between Pearl Harbor and where we are now. That's what, 70, how many years is that? and I sometimes play a game. What are the, think about what are the largest events in human history? If you had to make a little list. My own view is that the passion, crucifixion, and for the faithful resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth in roughly the year 33 is arguably the largest event in human history. It determines how we tell time. So you got anything to beat that? The second thing, I think, is the Second World War, because it was the first time we actually established the means by which we could exterminate a large portion of human life.
Given your passion for history, talking about the greatest events, what's the book you want to write before you quit writing?
I would love to find a way to make the rise, fall, and rise again of the American Union in the 19th century compelling. I think that one of the tricks is, one of the difficulties I should say, is people don't love reading about failure. So as fascinating as the 1850s are, and should be, there's not a lot of passion about James Buchanan out there. I don't know if you've noticed this, but and you can come out heroically with Lincoln, but that part of the story is so well known. How we fell apart is something that I would love to find a way to tell in a compelling way that people would begin to see. Part of the reason for that is, one of the reasons I like writing what I write is that I think history should not be a social antidepressant. It shouldn't be so often, but it should, I think, properly understood, give us some sense that the problems of the present are not insurmountable. A perhaps overly facile line, the way I think about this is we learn more from historical figures not when we look up at them adoringly or down on them condescendingly, but try to look them in the eye. And if you look them in the eye, what you find, whether it's Thomas Jefferson or Andrew Jackson or George Washington, anybody, is you find that they are incredibly flawed, frail people driven by appetite and ambition and riven by sin and shortcoming. But they were, at an hour of maximum danger, they managed to transcend those limitations, however briefly, to put us on the right path. And if we see them for what they were, which is to say that they were men before they were monuments, then the kind of folks you work with all the time and the kind of people I write about all the time, today, we should have, I think, a little more optimism about the possibilities of the future, because people were not making monuments of Thomas Jefferson in real time.
Yeah, and he wasn't subjected to a 24/7 trivia either.
Well, I've discussed this with some people you're close to, and you have to credit the people in the arena, God bless them, Senator Alexander, Senator Corker, Governor Haslam, all those folks. Thank God they do what they do. But, Jefferson was first attacked for his relationship with Sally Hemings, his African-American mistress of 40 years standing, when he was still in the White House, in an expose that, with the exception of about 2 small facts, pretty much holds up 212 years later. So, and Jackson had 2 bullets in him, and that wasn't because he was having a great time, everybody's being nice to him. George Washington almost did not stand, I'm not going to say run because no one opposed it, almost did not stand for a second term because he was so tired of the criticism he was getting. Let me say that again. A man who never had a political opponent, unanimously elected President of the United States, not once but twice, almost retired early because he was tired of being criticized. James Madison had to write a farewell address in 1793 that then they held on to. if the fella who had no opponents was feeling wounded, no wonder this crowd feels like,
Yeah, exactly.
Jesus at 12:02.
Your point about optimism is so good. Looking at it,
It's okay, so he got back up. It's all right.
looking at it all from that perspective,
I'm Episcopalian, I'm not a Christian.
all right.
That is, I want to withdraw, I want to retract that now. I'm not going to hurt me. It's okay.
We'll put that one down. Looking at it all from that perspective, I mean, we think we're in the worst period of partisanship the country's ever seen. You agree with that?
No, again, because Andrew Jackson used to shoot people. You know, Jackson once said that his only two regrets in public life were that he had not shot Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, and had not hung John C. Calhoun, his vice president. No one felt that way about their running mate again until John McCain.
You get a point for that one.
I miss her.
She'll be back.
No, I think that, no, it's not that it's not good. There are a couple of things. And again, Senator Alexander is very eloquent on this. I asked him the other month, because it's been 40 years exactly since Lamar Alexander first ran for office in Tennessee, losing to Blanton in '74. And I said, what's changed the most? And he said it was, now I'm paraphrasing, the rapidity and the constancy of the criticism. And I have watched members of Congress look at their Twitter feeds, which is the single most depressing thing I
Stupid thing.
yeah, I can possibly imagine. So I do think that it's more institutionalized, partisanship now. Again, my sort of overly simple way of thinking about it is, I think of partisanship now as a 24-hour demolition derby between two of the least fuel-efficient trucks you can imagine. They just keep running into each other, but they need gas all the time. And it doesn't really matter what it is that goes in the tank. It just requires something. And so you have this, to mix metaphors, you have this feedback loop. Any small thing goes into the machine to keep it going for 2 more hours until someone else says something. And so I can see it as debilitating, demoralizing, dispiriting. But is it really worse than, say, when states were seceding and going to war? No.
Another quick question. Okay, Mike over here. Yell at us.
You've written both about Jefferson and Jackson. What changed between the election of Jefferson to Jackson? There's a huge gap between them. What was going on that led to this change that we could go from Jefferson to Jackson?
Oh, that's a great question. The central change, I think, is you had Jefferson. The first 6 presidents of the United States were all either Virginia planters or Adamses from Massachusetts, right? So Andrew Jackson, born in March of 1767, was from the lowest part of the farthest pole of white society from Thomas Jefferson. He never knew his father. His father died before he was born. His mother died in the Revolution. His brothers died in the Revolution. He believed that his family's blood had consecrated the Union. That's why I believe actually he sided where he sided on the question of nullification. He believed that we were one great family and that we could argue and fight, but that in fact this was a sacred undertaking, and that to break apart would be to invite European adventurers back, and that would in some ways undo or certainly dishonor the sacrifice of the Revolution. What changed between 1801, this month in 1801, which is when Jefferson actually finally won the election in the House, and 1828, 29, when Jackson won, was an increasing, the franchise, the suffrage was wider, the country was becoming more democratic. There was still, as there is unto this hour, a very strong sense that centralized power, centralized government was something to be avoided unless one approved of what that centralized government or centralized power was doing. Thomas Jefferson was brilliant at that. No one ever spoke better in needlepoint pillow terms than Thomas Jefferson. There was no wiser, no more eloquent advocate of states' rights. But when he wanted to buy Louisiana, he decided that we should not be tripped up on what he called metaphysical subtleties. Trust me, if Alexander Hamilton had tried to do this, it would not have been a metaphysical subtlety. So, to some extent, that's the nature of politics, it's the nature of pragmatism, the art of the possible, and all of that. What I do think changed was Andrew Jackson was the first truly self-made man to become president. And the fact that he defeated John Quincy Adams is a vivid embodiment of this shift from a society based on birth to one based still on wealth and position, but wealth and position that could be won in a lifetime and was not preset by your birth. I think that's the difference.
Okay, good question. Another question?
You've mentioned how much competition there is for our attention these days, and also how you alluded to how we have a politics that doesn't seem up to the challenges of the day. I'm wondering if, having participated as a journalist in the news cycle, but seen in a somewhat longer arc as a historian, if you could comment on the things that should be getting our attention that aren't.
That's a great question. I think there are, stop me if this slightly recalibration is off point, but one of the things I try to think about is when we're talking about Jackson, or we're talking about Jefferson, and we're talking about slavery and Native American removal and the enormous shortcomings and derelictions of their time. If you do what I do, there are a couple of reactions, right? You can either feel quite superior to the past and take them to task and wag one's finger at it, at those who came before. My own view is that Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Had it right when he said that self-righteousness in retrospect is easy, also cheap. And that if we, my view of this is that the moral utility of history is not to make ourselves feel better, but should be to try to make ourselves aware what are the issues in our own time that for reasons of political, moral, economic, and cultural convenience we are allowing to go unaddressed. That the next 30 years, the next 40 years, the next 50 years, people will look back and say, how on earth could you have allowed that to happen? In the lifetime of 60% of the people in the room, maybe more, in this region, African Americans would try to go in to vote, and poll workers would put a box of detergent on the table and say, well, if you can tell us how many flakes of soap are in this box, you can have a ballot. If that had not been the prevailing reality, we would not have required the legislative achievements of 1964 and 65. So whenever I'm beginning to feel quite superior to Jefferson because of slavery or Jackson because of Indian removal, I try to think, all right, what's happening right now that somebody's going to be able to say, you totally took a dive for convenience. My own opinion is that, and it's an issue that's being discussed now, much more discussed than attacked or worked on. I do think income inequality and the falling standards and definition of the middle class over the last 25 years is a huge one. I believe that climate change is an enormous question, and one that we will, it's going to require, unfortunately, several superstorms like Sandy, like that one, to hit New York and Washington and other places before there's a kind of recognition that that's something that has to be addressed. But I do think that unquestionably there are unfolding issues in our time that for reasons of convenience, we can disagree about the causes, the effects, the solutions, but I would imagine that one sign of a healthy body politic would be at least acknowledging that there is a problem. And my own view is that without that kind of common recognition, that's where the political culture fails to be commensurate with the challenges.
Great question and answer. What are your politics?
They are hopelessly muddled. They really are. I was enormously
Very intelligent answer.
well.
Seriously.
It's honest. There are people who are absolutely convinced I'm a right-wing stooge. There are people who are convinced that I must be on the take from Obama. Often for saying the same thing. I really don't. I mean, Ronald Reagan was to my generation not unlike what Franklin Roosevelt was to his generation. He was an enormously important figure. I found him imaginatively compelling. My interest in politics, aside from my familial interest, my sort of national interest, is partly because of the compelling national presence that he provided. I think that I voted for presidential candidates of both parties. I voted for, I lived in New York, so there wasn't really much of a choice, and now I live here, so there's not much of a choice. So I sort of go
Which
from,
is amazing.
Yeah, no, my presidential vote has never mattered in my adult lifetime. I guess I'd have to move to Ohio, and that's not going to happen. So, but they're mixed, and they're probably, I suspect, I don't want to say that. I believe that it's one of the reasons I was telling Tom before. I think that Governor Haslam should be talked about a lot more as a potential national candidate, as a potential presidential aspirant in the Republican field. And one of the reasons I thought this was I think this move he made toward community college being universally available is a fantastic, should be totally bipartisan move. Because if you're a Republican, it is a case where the public sector is trying to create conditions for private prosperity. I mean, that's one of the definitions of good government, it seems to me. If you're a Democrat, then access to education should be something that's defended and preserved and extended. And the greatest pieces, in the last 70 years, I think it's safe to say that we have been at our strongest, most united, and most productive when government has created the conditions for private prosperity. So whether it's the GI Bill, whether it was defense spending through the Cold War, the interstate highways, access to the ballot, access to integration being a huge part of this. We have done best when the government has tried to create a context in which private enterprise can thrive. And In the old days, that would have fit as sort of an Eisenhower Republican position, or even in more recent times, kind of a New Democrat position. Today, I'm not quite sure where it fits.
We frequently don't have enough time for the conversation, and that's true tonight. Thank you very much for coming, and hope you'll come back in 2 weeks and join me with the former Governor Russ. Thank you for being here.